when we'd just been introduced. And I saw this man rise up from the auditorium, I mean, not very far away from me, and approach at high speed and run up onto the stage and attack me. A man wearing dark clothing and a kind of black COVID face mask, so I could only see the top half of his face. And he attacked me very, very, very violently.
And so many years after the fatwa, did you think, this is it coming at last?
Well, there was a period in those first 9 years or so after the fatwa when I was living in England under kind of maximum police protection, when, of course, I had to think about the possibility of an attack. And in those years, I was told by intelligence services of a number of serious attempts of, they believed people to be in the country, who had entered the country in order to carry out the threat. So it was a fairly constant thought in those years, and in kind of much closer to the front of my mind than of late. But, I've been living in New York City now for almost 25 years. And for the first 23 of those 25 years, I was leading a perfectly ordinary writer's life. I was doing what writers do, sitting at home writing. I was doing book tours and readings and lectures and, the kind of things that writers get asked to do. And there had never been a hint of trouble. And so I had begun to think of this as being in the past, that this subject was closed. And then, at least for this one young man, it wasn't closed, unfortunately.
A lot of your book is a very interesting fictional attempt to have a conversation with him. And you give him some quite good lines. It's not a one-sided conversation. He is still awaiting trial. How do you feel about him now, or do you not feel anything at all?
I feel much less than I did. I think the book was a way of, in my mind, of dealing with him, and I feel that for my purposes anyway, I've dealt with him. I still would like the law to deal with him, and I hope that will happen sooner rather than later. Because I think, in a way, in my mind, I can't declare the subject closed until he's been sentenced. And I don't at this point know when that might be.
Now, the actual attack itself, you describe very vividly in the book. It is completely horrific. You are stabbed multiple times all around your body, including in your left hand, and you lose your right eye. There's a period, it seems to me, where you really think you're going to die, and those you love around you also think you're going to die.
Yes. No, I think certainly at the moment when I was lying on the stage bleeding, it was fairly clear to me that this was probably the end, and then fortunately it wasn't. Because they got a helicopter there and they got me to the trauma hospital in time, and then there was this immense surgery. I believe to something like 8.5 hours, and everybody who cared, and the news was coming out. I learned about this obviously subsequently. But the news was coming out very erratically. So my family and my wife, Eliza, were hearing contradictory things. They were hearing that I was dead, or no, actually I was fine, or a whole range of reports. And so it was really bewildering for them because they really didn't know what to think.
And when you were lying there, presumably in excruciating pain, can you remember what was going through your mind?
Well, mainly that I felt sad that I might be dying far away from home, in the company of strangers. That's what I was thinking. How lonely it was to die in that way. But then I also had another voice in my head whispering, "Live." And I don't know what that voice was. I can only think that it was something like what one might call a survival instinct. Just insisting repeatedly, "Live." And so that's what I was trying to focus on.
And that is, despite the horrific injuries, what you did. How appalling has it been to you to lose the sight of one eye since?
It's pretty bad. I won't deny it. I've obviously adjusted to some degree. You have to learn new techniques of being in the world to compensate for the loss of this whole quadrant of on the right-hand side of your field of vision. But I still mind. I mean, I mind every day. On the other hand, I'm also conscious of a piece of real, in the midst of bad fortune, a piece of real good fortune, which is that the knife which penetrated my eye stopped maybe a millimeter or two short of my brain. And as a result, there was no brain injury.
Yes.
And that allows me to go on being me, I think, because even a small touch of the knife on the brain could have had incalculable consequences of behavior and character. So fortunately, that did not happen.
Now, you have become, perhaps against your intention or expectation, a kind of global figure for free speech around the world. You said yourself, free speech is the whole ball game. It's the whole thing. It's very, very important indeed. So what do you feel at the moment about the continuing threats to free speech, particularly post-Gaza, these huge demonstrations that have shut down entire American universities, so there's no in-person teaching?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very bad time for free expression. Even before the Israel-Gaza situation, it was a bad time because there were new pressures against free speech, and even I think there is a very let me say principled younger generation whose priorities are environmental issues and social justice, and they see those issues as being above free expression. And that if free expression comes into conflict with social justice issues as they define them, then it must be limited. And that's, I think, a very slippery slope. But we've been on that slippery slope for some time. And now, of course, yes, I think, I've been for 20 years on and off teaching in American universities. First for 10 years at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and then for the last 10 years here at New York University. And I've never seen a time so contested, so difficult for universities to handle. And on the one hand, you want students to be able to protest. I'm a child of the 60s. We were protesting against the Vietnam War, and we certainly saw it as our right to protest. On the other hand, when it spills over, as it often has, into threats against Jewish students, there's many reports of that. Then that's very problematic, and I mean, very hard for university administrators to get it right. And I'm sure they're all trying to get it right. And in some cases, people feel they've got it very wrong, from both sides. I mean, I've seen people accusing the administrators of Columbia University of siding with the terrorists. And I've seen other pieces saying that they're suppressing pro-Palestinian free speech, and so they get it from both sides. It's very hard to navigate that.
And you're in New York, but we've had much the same here in the UK. I mean, in London, we had a man stopped by the police during a Palestinian march and accused of being openly Jewish. And we've got other people of the Jewish community in London who feel scared to go onto the streets, they say. So your reflections on the danger, particularly for the Jewish community at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you say. I think anti-Semitism has been on the rise. And it's very easy. I think a lot of people protesting what's happening in Gaza would say that they were protesting the Israeli state rather than making anti-Semitic remarks, but it slides very easily
from one to the other.
From one to the other, and some at least of the protesters have made that journey from protesting against the Israeli government to straightforward hostility towards Jewish people. And that's obviously greatly to be regretted and even feared. Look, I'm not a big fan of Mr. Netanyahu, and I'm horrified by the deaths happening in Gaza. But that doesn't mean that I forget about what Hamas did on October the 7th and what Hamas continues to want to do. I mean, I've seen interviews with Hamas leaders saying they don't want peace, they want perpetual conflict with Israel. Difficult to have ceasefire now when one of the parties wants perpetual conflict.
Yeah.
And, by the same token, it's difficult. One wants to ask Mr. Netanyahu how exactly he's going to destroy Hamas by bombing Gaza when its leaders are living in the lap of luxury in Qatar and safe from all the attacks. So given that both sides, whether it's Hamas or Netanyahu's government, are so, in my view, unpleasant, it's very hard to see the path of justice.
Your terrible trouble started back in 1989 from Iran with Khamenei and the fatwa. We now again see Iran operating very assertively around the West, certainly in America, certainly in Britain, through their agents, through their operations. I wonder how you feel about, as it were, the long arm of Iran around the world, stirring up extreme Islamism.
Well, I try not to think about Iran if I can help it. That's the truth. I never had a particular interest in it, except that they were trying to kill me, which makes one interested.
Yes.
And I mean, they are who they are, and they've always been that. And I was admiring of the primarily women's protest in recent times against that regime, but it's very cruel towards its citizens and towards any opposition. I think, it's in the nature of dictatorships to fall, and eventually I hope that will happen, but doesn't look like happening anytime soon.
Reading your books, you seem to me to be very much still a man of the Enlightenment, looking at stories, looking at fables through an Enlightenment point of view. And I wonder if even in these dark times, you look forward and think that there will be a post-theocratic world one day.
I hope so. I hope it happens in my lifetime. But I hope that will be so. I mean, when I was younger, that was a pre-theocratic world, and certainly we never thought that extremist religion would become as important as it has become. And so one can only hope that the wheel turns again. Because I do think one of the interesting things about the Enlightenment intellectuals, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, is that they were aware in their time that their primary opponent was not the state, it was the church. The church, with its weapons of anathema and excommunication and the Inquisition and so on, was the most powerful limiting force against freedom of thought. And they saw that as the thing they had to change. And now we're again in a position where more than one religion, not just Islam, but evangelical Christianity in America just as much, are in that position of trying to impose their censorship on the world, and they need to be resisted as the Catholic Church needed to be in the 18th century.
So the intellectual enemy, if you like, is not Islam, it is any theocratic and aggressive and assertive form of religion, including evangelical Christianity.
Very much so. I mean, it's the power of evangelical Christianity in America is shown clearly. That was what drove the reversal of the Roe v. Wade abortion judgment. And it's a very powerful factor in Trumpism. So, it's a ruthless. I mean, I don't know how Christian it is, but it thinks it is, or it alleges that it is.
And how do you feel now about the possibility of going through another Trump presidency?
I'm one of the few people who believes that he will not win.
Do tell us more.
Well, I was wrong when he was fighting Hillary Clinton, so don't trust me. But I do think that the abortion issue has been a colossal issue ever since the reversal of Roe v. Wade. And in every state election since then, the Democrats have made enormous gains on that single issue alone and have won victories because of the colossal vote of women in their favor and against the Republican Party. So that's one factor. Another is, he might be in jail.
Yeah.
And
he can fight from jail, of course, can't he?
He can. Yeah. But there have been opinion polls, even amongst Trump hardline voters, several substantial percentages of which have said that if he's actually convicted of a crime, then they would not vote for him.
That's very... Listen, we've been covering lots of fairly grim and serious subjects, and I wouldn't want to end on that. This book is not a bitter book because it's also a love story. Just explain to people listening.
Yeah, because, my wife, Rachel Eliza Griffiths, wonderful writer, by the way, novelist, poet, also photographer, ridiculously talented. We've been together for 7 years now, and more than 7 years. And with the exception of this appalling intervention, we'd been extremely happy. And then what happened is at the time of the attack, she just became an extraordinary support and ally and took over my life at my lowest ebb. And one of the reasons I'm able to be talking to you in reasonably good shape is her efforts on my behalf. So yeah, I wanted to say that in a way we were in a love story, and then somebody tried to turn that love story into a murder story, and we've now been working very hard to try and turn it back into a love story. And she's very much the heroine of the book.